Why was she even here? That was the question written on every face when Sarah Martinez first walked through the gates of Paris Island. She felt their eyes cut into her, measuring her, dismissing her before she even had the chance to prove herself. Barely 5'2", 115 pounds, she looked more like a freshman carrying books to class than a Marine recruit carrying the weight of her country. And she could feel the judgment like heat on her back as she fell into line with the others. They whispered, some didn't bother hiding it. How did she pass the screening? Who let her through? Was this a mistake? Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. She was used to this silence, the kind of silence you carry when you've been doubted your entire life. In high school, the coaches had overlooked her for the varsity teams. Too small, too fragile. In college, professors had assumed she couldn't handle hard courses. Even her own family had doubted her decision to join the Marines. But inside her chest, something burned. Her father's voice echoed, a boxer's voice, low and steady. Size isn't strength, Sarah. The mind wins the fight before the fists do. Remember that. She tried to hold onto those words, but the first days of boot camp were merciless, for everyone. And for Sarah, they were brutal in ways that cut deeper than muscle fatigue. Uniform distribution was supposed to be routine. For Sarah, it became another humiliation. Nothing fit. Sleeves hung loose, boots swallowed her ankles, belts wrapped twice around her waist. The drill instructors laughed about having to order children's sizes. The recruits laughed with them. Later, when she couldn't reach the top bunk without dragging over a step stool, the laughter turned into something sharper. A football player named Marcus Johnson shook his head. Elementary school must have lost one of their Girl Scouts. Another Tony, a farm boy with arms like ropes, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Can't wait to see what happens when Barbie here tries combat training. She wanted to shout back, to tell them she had earned her place like anyone else, but the words stuck. At meals they sat in groups, city kids with city kids, athletes with athletes, farm boys with farm boys. Sarah sat alone. Her fork scraped against her tray in the long silence of being unwanted. But while they laughed and boasted, Sarah's eyes worked differently. She studied. The way the drill instructors moved. The way they demonstrated each stance, each march, each exercise. She saw things others didn't, the patterns, the timing, the rhythm underneath the commands. And though her arms trembled during push-ups, though her pull-ups dragged longer than the rest, there were places where she surprised them. Her running times matched theirs. Her footwork was exact. Her drill formations were flawless. She didn't have the power they admired, but she had precision and she clung to it. That didn't stop the mockery. By the second week, hand-to-hand combat training began. That was when the whispers turned into open bets. The first time she was paired with a recruit twice her size, the match lasted less than 10 seconds. He lifted her like a rag doll, slammed her into the mat, and walked away shaking his head. The others laughed until their voices echoed off the gym walls. Sergeant Williams, 6'4", muscle stacked on muscle with a voice that cracked air like thunder, used her as a lesson. Look at this. You think she can protect your back in combat? Huh, you want her watching over you. The silence afterward hurt more than his words, because silence meant agreement. That night Sarah lay in her bunk, blinking hard against the tears that burned her eyes. She wasn't supposed to cry. Marines didn't cry, but she wasn't sure she even belonged among them. Her bunkmate, Jessica Chen, broke the silence. Jessica was taller, stronger, a woman who had already earned the respect Sarah craved. She leaned over and whispered so softly only Sarah could hear. "Stop fighting their fight," Jessica said. "You'll never beat them at their own game, but that doesn't mean you can't win." Sarah turned her head, staring at the ceiling. The words sank like hooks into her. She thought of her father again, of how he told her stories of smaller fighters who toppled giants, not by force, but by patience, by timing, by turning weight into weakness. That night something shifted. The next morning, She didn't drag her feet to the training grounds. She went with something else in her eyes. She began studying differently, not to match their strength, not to prove she could do what they did, but to find something else. She found manuals in the base library. She studied combat like others studied for exams. Leverage, momentum, pressure points. At night when the others snored, she stole minutes under the dim bathroom lights, practicing footwork, memorizing the angle of throws, testing the timing of shifts she'd only read about. The others thought she was breaking, giving up, preparing to wash out. Marcus Johnson even started a betting pool. When would Sarah Martinez quit? Some laughed that she wouldn't make it past the third week. But she wasn't preparing to quit. She was preparing for something else entirely. By the third week, the training turned brutal. Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, MCMAP, a blend of disciplines designed for real combat, not tournaments. The recruits puffed out their chests, trying to look powerful. Sarah moved differently. She kept her balance. Her stances were neat, precise. While others slammed into each other recklessly, she studied the details. When an instructor demonstrated a throw, she watched not just the arms but the hips, the subtle shift of weight that made the throw work. And though she still fell, though the mat burned her back, she was no longer humiliated. She was learning. Each fall whispered something to her. That didn't work because you leaned wrong, that grip can be broken, that balance can be taken. The others couldn't see it. To them she was still the weak one, the laughable one, the mascot. But late at night, when the barracks fell silent, Sarah was in corners, practicing alone. She whispered to herself, moving slow, repeating motions until they imprinted into her bones. And she began talking to those who beat her, not out of shame but out of curiosity. Jake Sullivan, a bouncer from the Bronx, towered over her and tossed her aside in sparring. Afterward, she asked him questions. How he handled fights in crowded clubs. What worked against drunks. What didn't. At first, they laughed at her questions. Then they answered. Piece by piece, she collected their knowledge. Street fighting from the city kids. Farm strength tricks from the boys who grew up wrestling livestock. Even borrowed hints from military families who carried second-hand combat lore. Sarah was becoming a student of every fight, every failure. And without realizing it, she was building something none of them had, a library of their own weaknesses. One evening, as she practiced alone, another set of eyes found her. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, compact, muscular, scarred from tour in Iraq and Afghanistan. He didn't bark like Williams. He watched. And then quietly he stepped forward, correcting her balance, showing her where to rotate her hips, how to use her breath to sharpen a strike. It became their secret. In the shadows of the training halls, he showed her what strength could not teach. Psychology, calm, patience, the gift of being underestimated. Let them laugh, Rodriguez told her. Their arrogance is your weapon, make them believe you're weak. Then when it matters, turn it against them. Sarah listened. She absorbed. She carried those lessons back to her bunk and replayed them under the thin barracks light. Meanwhile, the cruelty only grew. Marcus Johnson organized what he called Sarah Watch. The recruits took turns mocking her mistakes, running commentary like a comedy act at her expense. Pocket Marine, Tony sneered. Mascot, Dave laughed. Even the other women began to step away, worried her weakness would stain them too. Sarah didn't argue, she didn't defend herself. She carried their laughter in silence, and in silence she built something dangerous. Rodriguez was right. Being underestimated was her camouflage. Their cruelty was her cover. And though they didn't know it yet, every insult, every laugh, every dismissal was sharpening her for something they would never see coming. Because soon, sooner than any of them imagined, Sarah would step onto a mat with 6 of them. And when she walked away, none of them would forget her name. Why was the gym so loud that morning? It wasn't just the sound of boots on the floor or recruits shifting nervously before the matches began. It was something else, the buzz of expectation, the chatter of bets placed, the murmurs of certainty. Certainty that Sarah Martinez would fail. The elimination matches were supposed to be a showcase, a chance for the strongest recruits to prove themselves before visiting officers. For most, it was an opportunity. For Sarah, it was supposed to be an ending. Sergeant Williams made sure of that. His booming voice carried over the recruits as he outlined the rules. Elimination style, one-on-one, winners advance, losers are out. And when Sarah's name appeared on the match sheet, the room tilted into laughter. Her first opponent, Kevin Torres, a college wrestler from California, undefeated in sparring, built like a statue, trained like a machine, the perfect executioner for the platoon's smallest recruit. The crowd's amusement wasn't cruel anymore. It was pitying. Sympathetic claps, half smiles. Some whispered about safety, about whether she might get hurt, but most whispered that it wouldn't last long. Kevin Torres smiled. He winked to his friends the same way he had before every easy win. Sarah stood in line waiting. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. She remembered Rodriguez's words, "Make them believe you're weak." She remembered Jessica's whisper, "Stop fighting their fight." And she remembered her father's voice, "The mind wins the fight before the fists do." When the referee called her name, she walked forward without hesitation. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The gym fell quieter. Torres stepped into the ring like a predator circling prey. He was already tasting victory, already planning his joke for afterward. The whistle blew. He lunged, the same grip he'd used dozens of times, the same grab that had crushed stronger recruits, pinning them with humiliating ease. But this time the prey didn't freeze. Sarah stepped aside, a shift so small most in the crowd missed it. Torres' momentum betrayed him. He stumbled, she pivoted, perfect timing, perfect leverage. His body hit the mat. Gasps cut the gym. It wasn't over. Torres scrambled, muscles straining, his pride clawing for recovery. But Sarah's grip had already found the right angles, pressure points, leverage against joints. She didn't overpower him, she redirected him. And the larger he fought, the more his size betrayed him. 30 seconds, that's all it took. Kevin Torres, the undefeated wrestler, lay pinned, unable to move. Sarah Martinez, the one mocked, dismissed, laughed at for weeks, stood over him. Silence, absolute silence. Sergeant Williams's jaw went slack. His hand twitched at his clipboard, as if checking if this was a mistake. Then the referee lifted Sarah's arm. And the gym erupted. Not laughter, not mockery, applause, cheers, shouts of disbelief. Marcus Johnson, the loudest voice of doubt, went pale. His betting pool collapsed in a heartbeat. Sarah didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just breathed steady, as if she'd seen this outcome in her mind 100 times before, because she had. Her walk off the mat wasn't triumphant. It was calm, collected, dangerous. But inside, her chest trembled, not with fear anymore, with the knowledge that everything she'd endured, every insult, every lonely meal, every tear she fought back in the dark, had led to this. The others still didn't understand. Not yet. They whispered excuses. Torres slipped, Torres underestimated, Torres made mistakes. But Sarah knew this wasn't luck. It was the first proof that she belonged. The next match was announced. Jake Sullivan, the bouncer, the man who had tossed her like trash in practice, the one who'd laughed with her tormentors. The gym filled even fuller now, word spreading fast. Marines crowded the bleachers, waiting to see if her first victory had been a fluke. Jake didn't smile this time. He had studied her, watched her fight Torres. He wasn't underestimating her anymore. When the whistle blew, he didn't charge. He circled, tested, probed. His arms jabbed, long reach keeping her away. Sarah adjusted, calm, watching his rhythm, the way his shoulders twitched before a strike, the way his stance shifted when he planned a grab. For minutes it was a chess match. Move, counter, step, retreat. The crowd grew restless, but Sarah wasn't rushing. She was waiting. Then Jake pressed harder. Aggression swelled in his movements. A barrage of heavy strikes, enough to break through most defenses. But aggression leaves openings. She saw it. A fraction too much weight on his front foot. A reach extended too far. She pivoted, redirected, and in a blur of practiced precision, Jake's size collapsed under his own momentum. His arm twisted. His stance broke. His body dropped. The crowd roared. Jake Sullivan, the one who had once made her a joke, tapped the mat in defeat. Sarah rose, steady, her chest heaving. The disbelief around her was louder than the cheering. She had beaten not one but two of the strongest recruits, and not by luck, by skill, by patience, by control. Jessica Chen's eyes found her from the sidelines, proud, fierce. Sergeant Williams's voice cracked when he called the next match. Dave Morrison, the farm boy, the one who had mocked her most viciously. This was personal, everyone knew it. Dave stomped into the ring like a bull, jaw clenched, eyes burning. He didn't want to just win. He wanted to humiliate, to prove that Sarah's victories had been accidents. The whistle blew. He charged with brute force. No caution, no patience, just raw power. Sarah braced, not against him, against herself, against the fear of being crushed. She let his weight crash toward her, then stepped aside. The mat shook as his body slammed down. The crowd gasped. Dave rose, angrier, charging again. Again she redirected. Again he fell. The more he attacked, the faster he burned out. His fury turned against him, his strength becoming his prison. And when his final lunge left him sprawled on the mat, Sarah didn't hesitate. She locked him in place, controlled him, ended it. The whistle cut the air. Sarah stood, Dave didn't. And in that moment, the gym erupted like thunder. 3 victories, 3 giants fallen. The recruits who had laughed now stared in silence. The officers in the bleachers leaned forward, whispering. The myth of Sarah's weakness had shattered, replaced by something none of them could name. But Sarah didn't smile. She didn't bask. She simply stood there, chest rising and falling, eyes calm, face unreadable. Because she knew what they didn't. This wasn't the end. Ahead waited Marcus Johnson himself, the ringleader, the loudest voice of doubt, the man who had mocked her name, her size, her existence. And Sarah knew if she could face him, if she could win, she wouldn't just prove herself. She would rewrite everything they believed about strength. The night before that fight, Sarah sat alone in the barracks, her thoughts heavy. She thought of the silence in the mess hall, the laughter in the training yard, the sting of humiliation when she lay pinned in 10 seconds on her first day. And she thought of her father, his scarred hands wrapping tape around his knuckles, his voice steady. Strength isn't what they think it is, Sarah. Strength is knowing you belong even when they say you don't. For the first time since she'd arrived, she believed it. The next morning when Marcus Johnson entered the ring, towering, confident, the gym trembled with noise. But Sarah Martinez didn't hear it. She heard only the quiet beat of her own heart. And she was ready. Why was Marcus smiling? That was the first thing Sarah noticed as she stepped into the ring. Not the noise of the crowd, not the officers leaning forward in their seats, not even the heat of the gym pressing against her skin. Just Marcus. He stood there tall, broad, his arms loose at his sides, and he was smiling. Not mockery, not amusement, something else. Confidence, a different kind of confidence, the kind that says, I've studied you, I know what you can do, and I'm ready. The room vibrated with anticipation. This wasn't just another fight. This was the confrontation the entire platoon had been waiting for. Marcus Johnson, the leader of the pack, the voice that had turned Sarah into a punchline, against Sarah Martinez, the recruit who had turned humiliation into a string of impossible victories. Everyone knew this fight wasn't about brackets or elimination rounds. It was about truth, about whether Sarah's rise had been real or just an accident waiting to collapse. The whistle blew. Marcus didn't charge. He didn't underestimate her the way Torres had or burn himself out with rage like Morrison. He moved with caution, precision. He had prepared for this. Sarah felt the difference immediately. He was controlling the distance, using his reach to keep her at bay. Every time she tried to step in, his arm pushed her back. Every time she shifted, he mirrored. For minutes, neither gained ground. The crowd leaned forward, restless. Sarah's chest rose and fell. She wasn't frustrated, not yet. She was patient. This was a chess game and she had played it before. But Marcus wasn't like the others. He wasn't careless. He wasn't arrogant. He had studied her victories, replayed them in his mind, and built defenses for each. He knew her rhythm, her timing, her angles. Every move she tried, he blocked. Every feint he ignored. And for the first time since the tournament began, Sarah felt something cold creep into her chest. Doubt. What if this was the end? What if they were right all along? She pushed the thought away, circling, adjusting. Rodriguez's voice echoed in her memory, "Stay calm. Let them show you who they are. Their habits are your openings." She breathed, watched, waited. Marcus's eyes locked on hers. He smirked again. He thought he had her figured out. Then it came, a subtle overcommitment. Just a fraction too much weight on his forward step. Sarah's body moved before her mind could catch up. She pivoted, grabbed, redirected. The world slowed. She remembered the maneuver Rodriguez had mentioned once, almost in passing. An advanced technique, risky, demanding perfect timing. She executed it with everything she had. And in an instant, Marcus Johnson, the football player, the powerhouse, the leader, was on the ground. The crowd exploded. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an accident. It was Sarah's technique, her patience, her precision, overwhelming brute force with quiet skill. Marcus grunted, trying to rise, but Sarah had him locked, controlled. He tapped the mat. The whistle pierced the air. The referee raised Sarah's hand. The noise was deafening. Cheers, applause, shouts. Marines pounded the bleachers. Officers nodded to one another, whispering, impressed. Sarah stepped back, chest heaving, sweat dripping down her face. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate, but inside something cracked open. Relief, vindication. Marcus sat up, staring at her. His face wasn't angry, it wasn't mocking, it was respectful. He stood, approached, extended his hand. "Martinez," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You earned that." The gym hushed. Sarah took his hand. Their shake wasn't just sportsmanship. It was surrender. It was an apology for every insult, every doubt. For the first time since she'd arrived, Sarah was tiny. She was mascot. She wasn't the punchline. She was a Marine. The crowd erupted again. This time it wasn't disbelief. It was pride. But Sarah didn't let herself rest, because she knew what came next. The final match. And her opponent was Marcus, wasn't Torres, wasn't Morrison. It was Elena Vasquez. Sarah had watched Elena fight. Tall, lean, black belt in karate before she'd ever set foot on Paris Island. Calm, precise, lethal. Unlike the others, Elena had never underestimated Sarah. She had studied her too, with eyes as sharp as Sarah's own. If Marcus had been her greatest doubter, Elena would be her greatest test. The gym buzzed louder than ever as the announcement spread. Officers filed in, trainers from other units, even journalists who had caught wind of the story. This was no longer just a training match. It was a spectacle. Sarah tried to block it out. She sat alone in the barracks that night, staring at the floor. Her hands shook, not from fear, from weight. The weight of every moment leading here. The laughter in the chow hall. The sting of being called weak. The nights she cried quietly into her pillow, so no one would hear. The secret training with Rodriguez. The voice of her father reminding her strength was more than muscle. And now, tomorrow, she would face the best. Rodriguez found her, sat down beside her in the dim light. His face was calm, steady, the face of a man who had seen wars most of them couldn't imagine. "You've already won," he told her. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've proved everything they said was impossible." Sarah swallowed, her throat tight. "But if I lose?" Rodriguez shook his head. "If you lose to the best, that's no shame. But if you win," he paused, eyes steady. "If you win, you change everything." Then he leaned closer. "There's one more technique. I've never taught it to a recruit. It's advanced, risky, but if you time it right, it could be the difference." He showed her, slow, precise, explaining each movement. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't brute force. It was subtle. A trap laid in stillness, sprung in a heartbeat. Sarah memorized it with every muscle, every nerve. That night she barely slept. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even anxious. She was something else, suspended between exhaustion and adrenaline, waiting for the final bell. The next afternoon the gym was unrecognizable. Marines packed the bleachers shoulder to shoulder. Officers filled the front rows. Cameras rolled. The air vibrated with anticipation. Sarah stepped forward. Elena Vasquez was already there. Calm, focused. No mockery, no smirk, just respect. They met eyes. Two fighters who had come different roads but ended here, the same mat, the same test. The referee raised his hand. Sarah breathed once, deep, slow. The whistle blew. Why did it feel so quiet, even in the middle of chaos? The gym was packed, voices rolling like thunder, Marines shouting, boots stomping, officers murmuring. Yet to Sarah Martinez, it all faded to silence. There was only the mat beneath her feet, the weight of her own heartbeat, and Elena Vasquez standing across from her. Elena's presence was different. She didn't mock, didn't underestimate. She carried herself with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to defend. Her stance was sharp, precise, her eyes locked on Sarah's as if she could see straight through her. Sarah steadied her breathing. She could feel sweat prickling at her palms, the tremor in her fingers. Not fear, something heavier. The realization that this was it, the final test. The whistle blew. Elena moved first. A calculated step forward, not reckless, not overcommitted, testing distance, measuring. Sarah shifted with her, cautious. The first exchange was lightning quick. Elena snapped a strike, Sarah deflected. No damage, no advantage, just a test. Another step, another exchange. Again, they neutralized each other. The crowd grew restless, but the fighters didn't rush. This was a battle of patience, of precision. For the first time in the tournament, Sarah felt herself matched in kind. Elena wasn't falling for overextensions. She wasn't underestimating. Every feint Sarah threw, Elena read. Every attempt at leverage, Elena countered. Minutes passed. Sweat slid down Sarah's temple. Her lungs burned. Elena pressed forward, strikes crisp, calculated. Sarah defended, redirected, waiting for that one mistake. But Elena didn't make mistakes. Sarah's chest tightened. Doubt pressed against her ribs. She's too strong, too skilled. She's everything they thought I was. The thought cut sharp, but Sarah bit it down. She couldn't let it live, not now, not here. She remembered Rodriguez's words, patience, calm, use their habits. But Elena wasn't showing habits, she was showing mastery. The pace quickened. Elena's strikes became a rhythm, sharp and relentless. Sarah absorbed, redirected, but she was retreating, step by step, her back inching toward the mat's edge. The crowd roared. Elena pressed harder. Sarah's arms ached from blocks, her legs screamed with each pivot. She could feel the edge behind her, one wrong step and she'd be out. Her lungs begged for air, panic whispered. What if I can't? What if I've come this far only to prove them right? Her father's voice broke through. Strength is knowing you belong. Sarah's breath steadied. She narrowed her eyes, watched closer, deeper. And then she saw it. Not a flaw, not a mistake, just humanity. In Elena's rhythm, a fraction of predictability. In her precision, a microsecond of overconfidence. so small no one else could see it, but Sarah could. The crowd saw Sarah cornered, they saw her trapped, but Sarah saw opportunity. Elena launched her strongest combination, a strike, a step, a follow-up designed to overwhelm, executed perfectly. Sarah moved. Rodriguez's final lesson, the risky maneuver he'd shown her in secret, surged through her body. She caught Elena's momentum, redirected it, twisted into leverage so sharp it cut physics in half. The crowd gasped as Elena's body shifted, her balance broken, her strength turned into weakness. In a heartbeat, Elena, the black belt, the favorite, the strongest fighter left, was on the mat. Sarah held, controlled. Every nerve screamed, every muscle burned, but she didn't let go. The whistle split the air. Elena tapped. For a second, the gym was silent. Then the roar came, louder than anything Sarah had ever heard. A thunder of applause, shouts, boots pounding the bleachers. Marines leapt to their feet. Officers clapped. Cameras flashed. Sarah released her grip, stumbling back, chest heaving, arms trembling. She could barely process it. She had done it. Elena Vasquez, the one no one thought could be beaten, rose slowly, sweat streaking her face. She looked at Sarah and smiled. Not in mockery, not in defeat. In respect. She extended her hand. Sarah took it. The crowd erupted again. In that moment, Sarah wasn't just a recruit. She wasn't just the underdog. She wasn't the tiny, the mascot, the pocket marine. She was the champion. Her eyes scanned the bleachers. She saw Jessica Chen clapping furiously, tears glinting in her eyes. She saw Marcus Johnson, arms folded, nodding in respect. She saw Torres and Morrison silent, humbled. And then her eyes found Rodriguez. He didn't clap, didn't shout. He just nodded once, steady and proud, the kind of nod that said everything without a word. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his voice rougher than usual. He had spent weeks mocking her, using her as the example of weakness. Now he faced her with something else, humility. "You proved me wrong," he said, his voice low but carrying across the gym. "And I'm glad you did." The officers conferred quietly, glancing at Sarah, at Elena, at the roaring crowd. They knew what this meant. It wasn't just a victory. It was a statement. A challenge to everything they thought they knew about strength, about combat, about what a Marine could be. Sarah barely heard them. She stood in the center of the mat, chest rising and falling, heart still racing. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't celebrate. She just breathed. Because inside her, something had shifted forever. She had carried doubt like a weight since the day she stepped onto this island. She had been mocked, dismissed, laughed at, humiliated, but she had endured. And now, standing under the lights, the champion of an elimination tournament no one thought she'd survive, she understood. Strength wasn't about size. It wasn't about muscle or reach or who could lift the heaviest weight. Strength was about standing when the world told you to sit, about fighting when everyone said you couldn't, about refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. Elena raised Sarah's hand herself. The crowd thundered again. And in that roar, Sarah heard something she had never heard before on this island. Belief. Why was it so quiet afterward? Not the crowd, they were still roaring, still pounding their boots, still shouting her name. Not the officers, they were still whispering among themselves, voices low but sharp with urgency. It was inside her. Inside Sarah Martinez, after the final whistle, after Elena Vasquez raised her hand in respect, after Sergeant Williams admitted he had been wrong, there was silence. Her body ached, her arms trembled, sweat dripped into her eyes, but beneath it all there was a stillness she hadn't felt since the first day she'd arrived. For the first time, she wasn't bracing against laughter. She wasn't shrinking under doubt. She wasn't fighting the urge to disappear. She belonged. The gym was chaos. Marines crowding forward, shouting in disbelief, replaying what they had just seen. Some recruits slapped her on the back, others shook their heads in stunned silence. Marcus Johnson pushed through the crowd. He had been her loudest critic, the voice that had branded her weakness into the platoon's culture. But now his face wasn't mocking. It wasn't even humbled. It was proud. He extended his hand again, firmer this time. "Martinez," he said, his voice steady, "you didn't just beat me. You made me better. You made all of us better." Sarah blinked, unsure how to respond. She just shook his hand, the grip strong, equal. Torres approached next, the wrestler, the one she'd shocked first. He looked down, shaking his head, almost smiling at the absurdity of it. 30 seconds, he muttered. "I thought it was a fluke, but it was. You earned it every second." Even Morrison, red-faced with humiliation still clinging to him, mumbled, "Guess you're not the mascot anymore." Jessica Chen was last, tears streaking her cheeks, grinning as wide as Sarah had ever seen her. She pulled Sarah into a hug that nearly broke her ribs. "I told you," she whispered. "Stop fighting their fight. You found your own." Sarah held on for a moment, her chest tight. Across the gym, Sergeant Williams stood stiff, clipboard forgotten at his side. For weeks, he had mocked her, singled her out, turned her into the platoon's punching bag. Now his face was unreadable, torn between pride and shame. When the crowd parted, he walked toward her. His boots struck the mat, heavy, deliberate. He stopped in front of her, towering as always, his shadow stretching across her. "Martinez," he said, his voice cracked once then steadied. "I was wrong, dead wrong." The words hung in the air. "You taught me something today," Williams continued. "Something I should have known a long time ago. Strength isn't what I thought it was. And you showed everyone here what it really means." For the first time, Sergeant Williams offered his hand. Sarah stared at it. Slowly she reached out. Their hands met, the moment heavy with something bigger than respect. It was an apology, a recognition. Rodriguez watched from the sidelines, arms folded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to. Sarah knew his pride ran deeper than words. The officers who had observed began to file out, murmuring to one another. Their eyes lingered on Sarah as if she were more than a recruit now, as if she were a case study, an example, a living argument for what training could accomplish. Rumors spread fast. Before the day was over, word had reached other companies, other units. By evening, Sarah's name was on lips across the base. "Did you hear about the tiny recruit who beat 6 Marines in a row?" "Impossible." "Not impossible, I saw it." In the mess hall that night, Sarah sat at her usual table alone at first, tray untouched. Old habits die hard. But one by one, recruits began to join her. Marcus sat across from her, silent, respectful. Jessica slid in beside her. Torres and Morrison soon after. For weeks her table had been empty. Now it was full. Sarah ate quietly, still processing. The laughter that once stung was gone. In its place was a silence heavier than noise, the silence of respect. Later, lying in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Sarah felt the weight of everything settle in. She thought of her first days, the ill-fitting uniform, the jokes about children's sizes, the humiliation of being pinned in seconds, the sting of tears she swallowed in the dark. She thought of Jessica's whisper, "Stop trying to fight their fight." Of Rodriguez's steady lessons, "Use their arrogance." Of her father's voice, "Strength is knowing you belong." She thought of every step that had led her here, every bruise, every laugh, every moment she almost broke. And she realized something. Her victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to every person who had ever been dismissed for being too small, too quiet, too different. To everyone who had been told they didn't belong. To everyone who had been mocked into silence. Her victory was proof that dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, endures, and when the moment comes, it acts. The next morning, the base buzzed with official talk. The officers had been impressed, more than impressed. They were considering incorporating what Sarah had demonstrated into training doctrine. Lessons about adaptability, about not underestimating recruits, about valuing strategy over brute strength. Sarah overheard whispers. They're going to use her as an example in evaluations. About damn time we stopped judging by size. But Sarah didn't crave the spotlight. She didn't bask in attention. She trained quietly, diligently. When recruits approached her with questions, how she pulled off certain techniques, how she stayed calm under pressure, she answered humbly. Not with pride, but with patience. She explained leverage, timing, balance. She showed them what Rodriguez had shown her. It wasn't about proving herself anymore. She had done that. It was about something bigger. As the days turned to weeks, the atmosphere in the platoon shifted. The same recruits who once mocked her now sought her advice. The same drill instructor who once ridiculed her now used her as a positive example. "Watch Martinez," Williams would say during training. "She knows what patience looks like. Learn from her." Sarah didn't let it swell her ego. She knew respect was fragile, easily lost if it turned into arrogance. She carried it with humility, the same way she carried her uniform, the same way she carried the memory of the girl who once sat alone in the mess hall. At night, when the barracks were quiet, she sometimes closed her eyes and thought of her father. She imagined him sitting in the corner, watching, nodding with that same boxer's pride he once showed in their tiny East LA kitchen. "You did it, Sarah. You proved them wrong, but more than that, you proved yourself right." And sometimes she thought of Rodriguez, the way he corrected her stance in silence, the way he told her that being underestimated was a weapon. She owed him more than words could hold. She thought of Jessica, too, the one who whispered hope into her ear when no one else did. Without that whisper, maybe none of this would have happened. Lying in the dark, Sarah understood that her journey wasn't just about fighting. It was about resilience, about the quiet strength to keep standing when everything in the world told you to fall. And though she had won the tournament, though she had shocked the base, though her name was spreading farther than she ever imagined deep down, she carried the truth quietly. The fight wasn't over, because life would always bring more doubters, more obstacles, more moments where the world would laugh before it listened. And she was ready, because Sarah Martinez had learned that real strength wasn't loud. It wasn't about proving yourself every second. Sometimes strength was silent. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why were so many eyes on her now? The next morning, Sarah couldn't walk across the training field without heads turning. Recruits she'd never spoken to whispered as she passed. Marines from other companies stole glances. Even some instructors who had ignored her before now paused mid-step, their eyes following her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was recognition. Word of her victory had spread faster than wildfire. The story had traveled from barracks to barracks, across the chow halls, through the command offices. By sunrise, it wasn't just her platoon that knew. The entire base was talking about the recruit who had shocked everyone, the one they'd called weak, who had taken down 6 opponents in a row. "Did you hear about Martinez? She's the one who dropped Tours in 30 seconds. No way, 115 pounds, come on." "I was there, I saw it, it wasn't luck. She made them look like amateurs." Sarah tried to tune it out. She trained the same way she always had, quietly, methodically, without drawing attention. But the attention found her anyway. During drills, she felt the weight of stares. During meals, recruits from other platoons sat near her, pretending it was coincidence. Some even asked her questions outright. "How'd you do it? Show me that move again, the one you used on Sullivan. What was going through your head when you faced Marcus?" Sarah gave them what she could. She explained leverage, balance, timing. She repeated what Rodriguez had taught her. She spoke simply, without bravado. But the truth was, she didn't want to be anyone's hero. Not yet. She hadn't joined the Marines to inspire others. She had joined to prove something to herself, that she belonged. And even after the tournament, that question still whispered in the corners of her mind. At night, lying in her bunk, she wondered, was this victory enough? Or was it just one fight in a lifetime of battles waiting for me outside these walls? The officers, meanwhile, had not forgotten. Her name reached the desks of men and women who rarely noticed individual recruits. Reports were filed. Words like exceptional adaptability, unpredictable resilience, case study in underestimated potential. One afternoon, Sarah was called to a private briefing. She walked into a small room where several officers stood in pressed uniforms. Sergeant Williams and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez were there too, silent in the background. A colonel spoke first. His voice was clipped, formal, the kind that left no room for wasted words. "Martinez," he said, "your performance has raised questions, important ones." Sarah stood at attention, her chest tight. The colonel continued, "For years our training has emphasized physical benchmarks, strength, endurance, size. You've demonstrated that those metrics, while important, are not absolute." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've shown us that intelligence, adaptability, and psychological resilience can equal or surpass brute force. That lesson cannot be ignored." Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. She wasn't sure if she was being praised or dissected. The colonel leaned forward. "We're considering adjustments to our evaluation criteria, broader definitions of combat effectiveness. Your example will be used in training discussions going forward." Sarah nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't want to be a lesson. She just wanted to be a Marine. Afterward, Rodriguez caught her outside the room. His face was calm, unreadable. "You're not just a recruit anymore," he said quietly. "You're a symbol. They're going to use you to prove a point." Sarah frowned. "What if I don't want to be a symbol?" Rodriguez's eyes softened. "You don't get to choose that. You only choose how you carry it." Those words haunted her in the days that followed. Because the whispers didn't stop, they grew louder. Some recruits admired her. Some envied her. Some resented her. For every hand that reached out in respect, there was another that folded arms in silence, muttering that she had been lucky, that it was exaggerated, that strength still mattered more. And Sarah felt the tension, the weight of eyes that praised her and eyes that doubted her. She found herself caught between worlds. The girl who had once sat alone at the mess table, invisible, and the recruit who now couldn't escape the spotlight. Jessica Chen tried to reassure her. "This is what happens when you do something no one thought you could. Half of them will love you for it. Half of them will hate you for it. But none of them will forget you." Sarah nodded, but the words didn't settle her heart. She wasn't sure she wanted to be remembered. Not like this. One night, as the barracks fell quiet, she slipped out. She walked to the edge of the training field, where the grass stretched dark under the moonlight. She sat down alone, hugging her knees to her chest. The silence pressed heavy. She thought about home, about East LA, about nights lying awake listening to sirens outside her window, about her father, his voice steady as he wrapped tape around his knuckles, telling her stories of fighters who had beaten giants. He'd told her once, "The hardest fight isn't the one in the ring, it's the one after, when everyone starts telling you who you are. You've got to remember who you were before they noticed you." Sarah closed her eyes, whispering the words back to herself. The hardest fight wasn't over, it had just begun. The next morning she returned to training. Same drills, same sweat, same bruises. She didn't slack, didn't strut. She worked like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Sergeant Williams, once her tormentor, now used her as an example. "Martinez, show them the stance. Martinez, demonstrate the throw." His voice carried pride now, not mockery. The recruits followed. Some imitated her movements, others asked for her corrections. She taught when asked, but she never raised her voice. She never sought the role. Rodriguez watched quietly. He never interfered, never boasted about being the one who had trained her in secret. He just nodded when their eyes met, as if reminding her silently, "Stay calm, stay patient." But Sarah knew the spotlight wasn't going away. Her story had grown larger than her, and with it came responsibility she hadn't asked for. She could no longer be invisible. She could no longer just survive. She had to carry what she had proven, not for herself anymore, but for everyone who came after her. For every recruit who would walk into this place small, quiet, doubted. For every voice that would whisper, "You don't belong." Sarah Martinez had turned humiliation into strength. She had turned silence into resilience. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she had become the proof that strength comes in many forms. She still lay awake at night sometimes, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she could live up to what they now saw in her, wondering if the respect would last or if it would vanish the next time she failed. But in those moments of doubt, she reminded herself of something simple. She didn't win by being what they expected. She won by being herself, by refusing to break. And that was enough. Because dignity doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for recognition. It endures, and when the moment comes, it rises. Why was her name echoing in places she'd never been? It started with whispers in the chow hall. Then came the nods from Marines in other companies. Then, one morning, Sarah noticed something different. Strangers saluted her with a quiet respect usually reserved for seasoned fighters. She was still a recruit, yet her story was no longer confined to her platoon. Word spread across Paris Island like fire in dry grass, and soon it spread farther. Other bases, other units. Stories rarely traveled this fast unless they carried something remarkable. The tiny recruit who beat 6 Marines in a row. The girl they mocked, who refused to quit. The one who changed what strength means. Officers began showing up to watch her train. Instructors from other divisions stopped by, observing silently, scribbling notes. She was no longer training in anonymity. Every step, every movement, every mistake was scrutinized. Sarah hated it. She had come here to disappear into the uniform, to blend in, to prove to herself that she could belong. Now she couldn't hide. Even when she laced her boots in silence, she felt the weight of eyes. Jessica noticed it too. One night she whispered across the dark barracks, "You realize you're famous, right?" Sarah shook her head on her pillow. "I'm just a recruit." Jessica's laugh was soft. "Not anymore, you're a story, and stories travel farther than we do." The words were meant as encouragement, but they gnawed at Sarah. Because stories had weight. And the weight pressed harder with each passing day. During drills, she felt pressure she'd never known. Every stumble became magnified. Every slow push-up drew whispers. If she faltered, it wasn't just Sarah Martinez failing. It was the story faltering. One afternoon, she misstepped during a marching drill. Just one slip, one moment of lost balance. Williams barked at her like always, but this time, the recruits didn't laugh. They looked at each other nervously, as if they'd just seen a crack in the armor of a legend. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, not from shame, but from the suffocating realization. She was no longer allowed to be ordinary. Rodriguez pulled her aside that evening. "You're carrying too much," he said. "You think you have to be perfect now, you don't." Sarah clenched her fists. "But if I fail?" "You will fail," Rodriguez interrupted, his tone sharp. "Everyone does. That's how we grow. The only difference is now when you fail, they'll watch closer. They'll test if you break. And that's when you teach them again that dignity doesn't break." Sarah looked away, her throat tight. "I didn't ask for this." Rodriguez's voice softened. "No one ever does. But the fight we don't ask for is often the one that matters most." The words lingered, but the weight didn't lift. A week later, Sarah's name appeared on an unusual roster. She had been selected for a demonstration before high-ranking officials visiting the base. Not just any demonstration, the one meant to showcase the Marine Corps' adaptability, its future. She stared at her name on the board, her stomach sinking. It wasn't about fighting now, it was about representation. She was Sarah Martinez anymore. She was the proof. Proof that size didn't matter. Proof that doubt could be defeated. Proof that the Corps could evolve. The night before the demonstration, she lay awake in her bunk. Around her, recruits snored, oblivious. Jessica shifted once, whispering into the dark. "You're thinking too loud." Sarah turned her head. "What if I can't live up to it?" Jessica smiled faintly. "Then you show them that living up to something doesn't mean being perfect. It means standing, even when you're shaking." Sarah said nothing, but her chest tightened with the truth of it. The next day, the gym was transformed. Flags lined the walls. Officers in crisp uniforms filled the seats. Cameras clicked. The recruits stood at attention, waiting for orders. Sergeant Williams called her name. His voice, once mocking, now carried pride. Martinez stepped forward. She walked to the center of the mat. Her boots felt heavy, her breath slow. The officers watched her like scientists watching a specimen. Her task was simple: demonstrate techniques she had mastered, leverage, redirection. The moves that had once made her invisible were now her stage. She performed them as instructed, calm, precise, no wasted motion. The crowd watched silent. But inside, Sarah felt something tearing. She wasn't fighting anymore. She wasn't surviving. She was performing. And though the applause came after each move, though the nods of approval rippled across the officers, she felt hollow. Because this wasn't why she had fought. She hadn't trained in silence to become a symbol. She hadn't endured the laughter to be turned into a lesson plan. She had done it to prove something to herself, that she was more than their doubt. Now that victory no longer felt hers. It belonged to them, to the officers who would use it, to the recruits who would quote it, to the stories whispered in places she had never been. That night, sitting on the edge of her bunk, Sarah stared at her hands. They were bruised, calloused, scarred from weeks of training. They looked nothing like the hands of the girl who had first walked through the gates, small and uncertain. But she wondered, did they still belong to her, or did they belong to the story now? Rodriguez found her again, silent as always. "You don't like it," he said, not a question. Sarah shook her head. "It doesn't feel real anymore. It feels like I've been taken." Rodriguez studied her, then nodded slowly. "That's because you're learning the hardest truth. Victory doesn't end the fight. Sometimes it starts a new one." Sarah's eyes stung. "So what do I do?" "You remember why you started," Rodriguez said. "You don't let them write your story for you. You carry it yourself. Quietly, steadily. That's how you keep it yours." Sarah sat in silence, letting the words sink in. For the first time, she realized the story wasn't hers to control, but the dignity inside her was. And that no one could take. Why did it feel harder now than when she was fighting? The matches had been brutal, yes. Her body had screamed, her lungs had burned, her muscles had ached. But afterward was heavier. Victory didn't silence the world. It only made it louder. Sarah couldn't walk through the base without hearing her name. Not just Martinez anymore, but that Martinez, the one who changed things, the one who made people rethink what strength was. Officers cited her in briefings. Drill instructors referenced her in lessons. Recruits told her story in hushed voices, like they'd been lucky to witness something they'd pass on for years. And Sarah carried it quietly. But in the quiet, she wrestled with something deeper. What happens when you've proven yourself? What happens when the fight you thought would define you is suddenly behind you? Nights stretched long in the barracks. Sarah stared at the ceiling, listening to the snores and rustling of her fellow recruits. Her body healed from bruises, but her mind replayed questions she couldn't shake. What now? Am I still me, or am I only what they see? Jessica tried to comfort her. "You changed things, Sarah, that's enough." But Sarah wasn't sure it was. Because beneath the respect, beneath the whispers of awe, she could still hear echoes of the laughter, the taunts, the disbelief that once surrounded her like chains. She had broken those chains, yes, but scars remain even after chains are gone. Sometimes she thought back to her first day at Paris Island, the ill-fitting uniform, the jokes about children's sizes, the isolation at meals. She remembered lying in her bunk, fighting tears, convinced she'd made a mistake. And she remembered Jessica's whisper that had sparked everything. Stop trying to fight their fight. It had been so simple, but it had changed her life. She thought of Rodriguez too, his quiet lessons, his patient corrections, his belief in her when no one else believed. His words stayed with her like an anchor. Use their doubt. Their arrogance is your cover. And she thought of her father's scarred hands wrapping tape, his steady voice. The mind wins the fight before the fists do. Without them she might have broken, with them she had stood. But standing had never been the end. Standing was only the beginning. Weeks passed, graduation neared. Sarah's platoon prepared for the final tests of boot camp. For others, it was a milestone, proof they had survived training. For Sarah, it felt different. She had already survived something harder than drills. She had survived being dismissed. On the day of graduation, recruits lined up in perfect formation. Families filled the stands, proud faces searching for their sons and daughters. The band played, the flags waved, the sun burned hot against pressed uniforms. Sarah stood among them, just another Marine. No spotlight, no stage, no crowd chanting her name. And in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Because this was all she'd ever wanted, to belong. Not as a symbol, not as an example, just as a Marine. After the ceremony, as families swarmed the field, Jessica found her. "They'll talk about you for years," she said, smiling. "But don't forget you're more than the story." Sarah nodded. She knew Jessica was right. Because the story was bigger than her. It had become a lesson, a myth, a piece of history on the island. But the truth lived inside her where no one else could reach. And the truth was simple. Strength had never been about muscle. It had never been about towering over others, or silencing them with volume, or winning through intimidation. Strength had been about silence, about patience, about carrying the weight of being laughed at, doubted, and dismissed, and not letting it break you. Strength had been about fighting her own mind when it whispered she didn't belong. Strength had been about standing up, again and again, even when no one clapped. Sarah Martinez had won the tournament. She had shocked 6 Marines, silenced her critics, impressed officers, and redefined what strength looked like. But her real victory hadn't been on the mat. It had been in the moments no one saw. The nights she fought back tears in her bunk. The times she practiced in shadows when everyone else slept. The meals she ate alone, holding her dignity close when laughter tried to steal it. That was the real fight. And that was the fight she had won long before the first whistle blew. As she walked off the graduation field, boots steady against the ground, Sarah felt the story settling into her bones. She didn't need to control it anymore. She didn't need to fear it. Because no matter what others told, no matter how they remembered her, she knew the truth. She hadn't beaten 6 Marines to prove she was stronger than them. She had done it to prove she was stronger than her doubt. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't argue. It doesn't shout down its critics. It waits. It endures. And when the time comes, it acts.